So friends, today we come to the end of our sermon series that we have been doing during Epiphany, where we've been exploring the stories of encounters with God. And I've got to say, I've really enjoyed this sermon series. You've probably picked up on it, but I'm a little bit of a Bible nerd. And in this series, I got to talk about some of my favorite stories that we have within the Bible. But another reason that I really liked this series is because of what you all have shared with me. Several of you have come and shared stories with me about encounters with the divine. And I've loved to get to know some of those stories. And again, I want to say that we have a podcast coming up where you can share those stories with the people around you. And I'm really looking forward to that. But as we move towards the end of this Epiphany season and into the Lenten season, you may have noticed that our next sermon series will be focused around prayer. And so we will talk about prayer, we'll talk about the practice of prayer, and we'll talk about the Lord's Prayer quite a bit and what the words of the Lord's Prayer mean. So today, as we finish this sermon series about encountering God, and as we move towards this Lenten series, I wanted to share with you one of my own prayer practices. Each week, one of the first things I do when I'm studying for this sermon is to pray. And I found that there's a kind of prayer that's really meaningful for me as I do this, as I prepare for a sermon. And this prayer is called Lectio or Lectio Divina. I've heard it pronounced both ways. It means divine reading. Is anybody familiar? Has anybody tried Lectio Divina before? It's a contemplative practice in which you sit with a passage and you pray the passage. And so you take a passage from the Bible and you read it out loud several times. And as you read slowly, you read patiently, you read even maybe a little bit naively, like you've been reading this passage or you are reading this passage for the first time. And as you read, you listen. And you don't just listen to the words of the passage, but you listen for what the Spirit stirs within you as you read. You listen to your heart, you listen to your mind, you listen to the Spirit of God as these words slowly stroll from your lips. And so you do this a few times with the passage, and each time that you read the passage, you ask a question. You ask God and you ask the Bible, the text, to reveal to you what it is that God wants you to take from this reading. And so each week I start with the text that we're reading for the sermon. And I pray for wonder, I pray for wisdom, and I pray for guidance, and then I ask God to reveal to me what it is that God has in this text. And I ask God what he has for you in this text. And so in my first reading, I ask a question. And the question is this: what in this passage surprises me or catches my attention? And as I read this week, the opening phrase, 6 days later, caught my attention. This word transfigured caught my attention. Elijah and Moses were having a conversation with Jesus. That caught my attention. And this voice from a cloud that says, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him." And then I read a passage for the second time. And this time when I read the passage, I ask myself, what are the questions that raise up in me as I read? What are the things that I might want to explore a little bit more deeply? Some of the questions that I had this week is, why does Peter want to build tents? Why does Jesus insist that the disciples remain silent until the resurrection? How did these disciples know that it was Moses and Elijah? How did the conversation between Moses and Elijah and Jesus really go? You know, I kind of imagine them being a little bit stuffy and holy, but then I think it's not really probably it. It's probably more like a Mel Brooks movie where they're giving the disciples a little bit of grief. But the big question for this passage, what does that term transfigured mean? Finally, I read the passage for a third time. And in my third reading, I'm asking this: what are the feelings, what are the sensations that are described in the text? Or what are the feelings and sensations that even rise up in me as I read? And so here I thought about the aching muscles as the disciples climb the mountain. I thought about whether this cloud that envelops the mountain was humid. I thought about the wonder and surprise of hearing the voice of God in that cloud. And this week, I noticed a pattern. I noticed something in this third reading that has been recurring throughout this sermon series. As we've gone through these stories of theophany, stories of encountering God, about encountering the God that has created all, that sends winds and storms on top of mountains, there's been this feeling that comes up every week. The feeling is terror. In each of these stories, the people in those stories experience terror. Encountering God, it appears, inspires terror. From Abraham to Jacob to Moses and the people of Israel, even the story of the eunuch last week, there's always been fear. And so today, Peter and James and John are terrified. They climb this mountain and suddenly their rabbi metamorphs somehow. Even the dusty robes that he wears becomes bleached, and two long-gone prophets who are known for their anger appear out of nowhere. A stormy cloud envelops them, and the disciples are terrified. It's mean, but I'm still thinking Mel Brooks. You know, I've heard a few sermons about this moment. And it seems that this moment in Peter's terror where he speaks up is something that we like to pick on a little bit, right? God and his liberators are having a moment, and Peter thinks, is this the right spot to pitch a tent? We kind of make fun of him for a bit. But I actually think that Peter might have been onto something in this moment. And I've also got a bit of respect for the fact that even in the midst of his terror, Peter still speaks. He doesn't let the paralyzation of the terror stop him. And then the days before this mountaintop experience, Peter had another experience that I think helps us to understand this a little bit. 6 days before this, Jesus had asked his disciples a question. He'd asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And on that occasion, too, it was Peter that spoke up. Peter said, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus affirmed this answer, and he began to teach the disciples what this Messiah meant. It meant that he would have to suffer greatly, that he would have to die, and that he would be raised again 3 days later. And again, at that moment, Peter spoke. But this time, Peter refused to believe what this Messiah was saying. He refused to believe that the one that is sent to save his generation would have to die to do it. It is a rather strange and scandalous claim, so Peter tries to pull Jesus aside to rebuke him. But Jesus beats him to the punch and rebukes Peter. "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus calls Peter Satan, an obstacle. Instead of standing in my way, says Jesus, "Get behind me and follow me." And so 6 days later, here we are. We're in this passage on this mountaintop, and it is Peter once again who speaks. Despite the past rebuke, despite the present terror, Peter speaks. Now I want you to imagine a little bit of what might have been going on in Peter's head. Imagine that you've learned that your rabbi, your teacher, is actually the long-awaited Messiah. And then imagine that appearing before you and this Messiah are two further messianic figures from your past. Moses, that liberated his generation from Pharaoh, and Elijah, who liberated his generation from the oppression of their own king and queen. And then imagine that you know neither Moses nor Elijah died natural deaths according to the scriptures. Moses, it seems, was personally cared for by God as the people left him behind. And Elijah is carried into the heavens in a whirlwind and a chariot of fire. And then imagine knowing also something else that Peter knows. He knows that the tradition of the prophets speak to this moment. That the prophet Malachi had promised that Elijah would come to restore Israel to faithfulness. And that Zechariah had declared that on the day that God's great king came to rule, all the nations of the earth would come to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of tents and dwellings. This is a feast that Moses himself had instituted. And so if you know all of that like Peter knows, then to build the tents doesn't seem like such a bad idea anymore. Peter's thinking the party's about to start. This Messiah has come, and with him, the great saviors of the past. And maybe like them, this means that Jesus doesn't have to die. If this is the day that God's king has come to reign, then maybe it's time to start building the booths. Poor Peter. This time, the rebuke doesn't come from Jesus. This time, we find yet another mountain enveloped with cloud, and within the cloud, we find the voice. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. And then just as suddenly as the experience began, it was over once again. The disciples are left on the top of the mountain with only Jesus. That's another phrase that caught my attention this week, only Jesus. And as those disciples came down the mountain after that event, Jesus again tells them not to tell the story until after the resurrection, which causes all the more puzzlement on the part of these pupils. And so the whole episode is a bit strange. Some of the questions that I had at the beginning of the week about this passage remain unanswered after I spent hours reading about it. The disciples left confused, and frankly, I'm still a little confused by the event myself. But even in the puzzlement, I think there are some things that we can notice. These things that have to do with these prophetic guests that come and visit Jesus and these disciples. So this presence of Moses and Elijah, it situates what's happening with Jesus. What God has been doing all along in and through the divine relationship with Israel. What God did through Moses, what God did through Elijah, God is still doing through this Jesus. This Jesus is participating in the story of salvation that had gone back all the way to the beginning. And further, the tradition that rose around these two people, around these prophets, Moses and Elijah, emphasized the fact that they continued the work after they were gone, and that the way that they continued that work was through their disciples. Moses and Elijah raised leaders for the next generation. They took disciples and they took and trained and taught them. Moses spent years with Joshua under his wing. Elijah passed his mantle on to Elisha. And the history of God's plan of salvation is just that. It's a history. It's a history of people that encounter God and invite the next generation into encountering God with them. They encounter God as their creator. They encounter God as their liberator, as their Christ, as their guiding spirit. It's an ongoing story in which every generation participates and invites the next generation into the story. And so Moses and Elijah were models of this kind of participation, models of teaching those who would come next to notice, to recognize the divine, and to listen to the divine voice. Even so, this moment still remains mysterious. Biblical scholar James Edwards says of this event, the transfiguration of Jesus is a singular event in ancient literature. It has no analogy in the Bible or in extra-biblical literature from the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, the rabbinic literature, Qumran, Nag Hammadi, Hellenistic literature as a whole. There's nothing to compare to this moment. And in light of this uniqueness, Edwards asks, how do we understand it? And I love the way that Edwards answers. Ultimately, he says, what the transfiguration actually means depends on you. It depends on who you know this Jesus to be. Who do you say that Jesus is? We speak pretty confidently in the church about the divinity of Jesus. It's like a fully divine and fully human being is something that's easy to grasp. We think that the world around us should be able to grasp it just as well as we do. But I don't know that we can really make it that easy. Even the disciples who witnessed this moment, this full glory of Jesus' divinity, walked down the mountain confused. But I do think that they remembered something. I think they remembered the voice they heard in the cloud. This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him. Shema. They spent the rest of their time with Jesus encountering the Christ. They're walking towards the events of Jerusalem and they're listening. They're listening so well to what Jesus says and what Jesus does that they cannot help but be changed. So who do you say this Christ is? If you know this Jesus as Messiah, if you know this Christ is the culmination of God's long history of salvation, if you know this human one is the one that will bring resurrection and redemption and reconciliation to all of God's creation, then this moment probably means something to you. Moses empowered Joshua. Elijah empowered Elisha, and Jesus called the disciples. He called those disciples to transform the world. And my friends, if you have encountered Christ, if you have encountered God, then you are the disciples. You are the ones that are called to participate and to invite into the next generation this story. Listen to him, my friends. In the name of the God that we have encountered, and the Christ who has set us free in the spirit of reconciliation, amen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.